whether they're a good idea or not. And then secondly, having done my first take at whether they're a good idea or not, answering that question. So I'm sort of doing two things here. I'm showing you what we're supposed to do with public policies, which is evaluate them critically, and then secondly, trying to answer the question in a provisional manner with this paper. Okay. Yep. Yep. Okay. So I'm just going to start with some preliminaries here. To in some ways clear the decks a little for what I'm trying to do with this paper. We talk about prevalence of OECD pay equity policies. I'm not really documenting policies here. I'm not doing what a lot of law scholars do, which is go through the minutiae of pay equity laws. I'm not interested in them. I actually don't think the minutiae are that important to what they do, but we'll talk about that. Then I'll talk about essentially what I'm trying to step into, the gap here, which is the lack of actual policy analysis of pay equity policies. They are public policies. They should be subjected to analysis. And there's basically no analysis on pay equity policies, as far as I can tell. And then I'll talk about what policy analysis is, how it's a distinctive approach to academic research and public policy research, and why it is necessary in light of what public policies do. Yeah, okay. So just as a general statement, like I said, I'm not going to talk a lot about the details of pay equity policies across the OECD space, but basically there's a variety of pay equity policies, and they tend to basically range from, on the left, what I would call the most strict or most intrusive types of pay equity policies, where pay equity reviews are mandatory, where they cover both public and private sectors, where the results of those pay equity policies need to be reported, and where the results of not following them to some degree are imposed and enforced through a coercive action like fines or regulatory suspension or something. Okay, so France and Finland are in that category. I would actually put California and Quebec in that category as well. The thing with Canada and the US obviously is their pay equity policies are at the subnational level, so they're not national level policies. So they tend we tend to find states and provinces across the spectrum as well. Generally speaking, the Canadian model is one that's like Australia. It's mandatory. It's a requirement for companies to engage in pay equity policies. Public sector definitely needs to do pay equity policies. And it's enforced, but it's enforced in a less coercive or punitive manner. So it's a sort of, sometimes there's a safe harbor, sometimes they got 3 years to catch up and come into compliance. It's a kind of soft enforcement mechanism. The United States, like I say, actually I might put Canada in that category as well, just variability, it depends on the state. We have everything from kind of California over here to somewhere like, let's say, Arkansas, where there's kind of very little or no pay equity policy. It probably has an equal opportunity law in the books, but not much else for that. Yeah, I'll take information questions, by the way.
Yeah, this is a question. So pay equity could mean like anyone with the same level of experience in education or whatever should get the same pay. I mean, that's sort of a very restrictive one.
Basic concept is equal pay for equal work.
What does equal work mean?
Well, that's the $20 million question. Yeah. So so pay equity basically means equal pay for equal work, and that if work is identical or nearly identical or comparable, or just sounds like it should be just as valued by the market, even if it's not, then we're going to say it should get the same pay. That's essentially what pay equity redounds to ultimately. Germany and the UK have had kind of more voluntary, non-enforced pay equity policies by the strong kind of administrative or organizational pressure on companies, certainly on the public sector, to engage in pay equity, at least audits, if not actual pay equity remediation. So the audits often tend to do a lot of the work. It's a kind of classic informational tool of governments. They put out information and then just let the private sector figure out what to do with that information. And then we have the East Asian exception, as so many cases. The East Asian exception, in this case, pay equity is basically there's no pay equity policies in South Korea and Japan. There's an equal opportunity laws on the books, but they're very rarely accepted by courts in terms of pay equity claims. So that's basically the OECD space. We have a wide variety of pay equity policies. I'm not that interested in parsing out the specific difference of pay equity policies because I think ultimately what the key takeaway here is there's not a lot of variation in what wage rates have done that have any bearing on pay equity policies. And I'll talk about that in a second. So that's one point. Okay. Yep. Is that right? Okay. So pay equity policies should be subjected to analysis. And what I'm going to discover in this paper and talk about is there's basically been no analysis of pay equity policies. The first serious attempt to actually justify them was this book called Comparable Work, Theories and Evidence by Paula England, published in 1992. This was when the first major pay equity policies were coming out. Australia had started in the early 80s. They were being introduced in the United Kingdom, in Ontario, and in some of the American states. And basically, Paula England is a kind of feminist economist and basically said, pay equity policies are justified because they're just such a great idea, right? They just seem and feel so right. And therefore, the complete quote at the end, when she's sort of summing up the costs and the benefits, says there are costs of any reform. Something that Mao Zedong might have said, there are costs of any reform. I have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. But for me, the prospect of ending the unfair and systematic devaluation of work because it's done by women makes the reform worthwhile, just because. So this was as far as analysis got in the early stages of pay equity. It sounded like a good idea. It felt like a good idea. Yes, there were going to be a lot of costs. We weren't sure if it was going to ever work, but it just said, the analysis was the extent of let's do it because it's just seemed like a good idea. Now, the following year, Stephen Rhodes, who's actually a public policy economist, say the University of Virginia, came out with a book with I think intentionally titled Incomparable Worth, because Paul England's book is called Comparable Worth. And Rhodes was actually an economist. And Rhodes actually went and studied early evidence on implementation in 3 places: Australia, the UK, and one American state. I want to say it was Minnesota. And Rhodes came away with a very different evaluation about pay equity policies. First of all, he saw that pay equity policies were politicizing wage setting. So wage setting was no longer being done based on productivity, but based on politics, office politics. He found that it was causing wage compression and wage inflexibility. In some ways, inflexibility is the definition of pay equity. It imposes wages through a centralized mandate system rather than through bargaining and productivity. So it's in some flexible by definition. Obviously, it causes wage compression because once you don't allow a full range of wages, but require some wages to be tied to the wages of others, it means that those higher wages therefore can't go up any higher, because if they do go up higher, they bring along a whole cohort of people that the organization can't afford. So big wage compression he observed and measured and documented. Increase in government control of society. Obviously, he found that governments were becoming very interested in the sort of micro decisions at the firm level on wage setting in areas that they had no expertise on and no understanding on, even in a context in which businesses themselves were always struggling to understand their businesses and often failing to. Government itself was even less able to understand what make wages make sense and not make sense in different contexts. Decline in female employment, interestingly enough. He found that pay equity policies were actually pricing a lot of women out of the employment market and causing a decline in female employment. We'll come back to that. Productivity declines were evident in all the sectors he studied. And interestingly, obviously, female wage suppression in male jobs. So as females moved into male jobs, traditionally male jobs, and those jobs were jobs that might otherwise have had higher wage rates. Obviously, those women themselves were in some ways getting a backlash from pay equity because they were now essentially classified as males whose wages were going to be held down to lower growth because those male jobs were now fastened backwards to traditionally female-dominated jobs, and therefore the male job wage increases were slower, and so females were getting in some ways caught up in this unintended consequence of pay equity. His conclusion: predictable and insurmountable problems have occurred wherever pay equity has been tried. To adopt it as public policy would bring us more acrimonious politics and a much weaker economy. Women and men would both be losers. So that's 1993. Now, this is interesting. At least there's evidence of some early analysis being done, but essentially, since Rhodes, as far as I can tell, and I guess I've spent like 6 months researching this, nobody has done any policy analysis on pay equity policies. So think about it, 30 years of a major labor policy across the OECD space that's not been subjected to any policy evaluation or policy monitoring research. That itself is stunning, right? And I would almost say that's a paper unto itself, is the sociology of knowledge of why somehow pay equity policies have been given a free pass, that it's somehow offensive to ask whether these make sense, right? And if as I scratch around, so the only kind of close to policy analysis work I was able to find since Rhodes was an ILO review done in 2006, International Labor Organization, comparative analysis promoting pay equity models and impacts, by Marie-Therese Chicha, who is an academic in Quebec. I had high hopes for this because if you look at the table of contents, she follows the policy analytic methods: problem structuring, policy prescription, policy monitoring, cost effectiveness, cost benefit, right? All the things we're supposed to do in policy analysis. But it turned out the ILO paper is largely assertive. She just largely asserts that this is working well and cites some evidence that seems to suggest it is, but it's really not policy analysis. And this is the ILO, right? I mean, if you say, well, it's too complex, we need to ship it, we need to contract it out to the ILO, to the UN system. Okay, so the ILO hopefully would get some heavy-hitting labor economists in to look at this. And there's no there in the ILO paper. The EU, interestingly enough, commissioned a similar paper on whether they should increase pay equity policies as an EU-wide policy to strengthen the application of the principle equal pay for equal work. And they commissioned this first, this study, which came out in 2019, the first response to it. The first response, the 2019 paper, was so analytically flawed that the Regulatory Commission of the EU sent it back and said, this is like not even an undergraduate paper, this is full of assertions, you haven't cited evidence to support them. So they forced them to do a revision, which came out in 2021. 2021 version basically says pay equity policies don't do anything, right? Because that's what the data shows, right? And it's clear the authors weren't happy with that, but that's the best they could kind of get out of the evidence, is they don't do anything or much. By the way, this paper I'm talking about is on my ResearchGate site. You'll find all the citations and the details on my paper on ResearchGate. So I'll just kind of talk through this. Anyway, so there we are. Major public policy across the OECD space, which has never really been evaluated. Okay, so what does policy analysis do? For those of you who are less familiar with policy analysis as a methodology, it's not social science, okay? It's not labor economics, it's not legal analysis. It's a distinctive form of logic and thinking that is designed to provide information that's useful for the policy process, for those who are in the fight, in the decision-making of policy process. So, starts out with problem structuring. What, if anything, is the problem? Is there a problem, right? So it's an important issue to ask whether there's actually a problem, meaning an unrealized benefit or an existing harm that public action could potentially seek a solution to. Second question, there's usually multiple approaches to solving a problem, even if there is a problem, which is the best one, right? So not all policy choices make sense. There's probably an optimal one. That's the second question. Effectiveness analysis. Does the policy X lead to improvements in the outcome Y? A simple causal analysis about, does the policy have any effect on the intended outcome? Okay, even if it does, is it worth it when we bring in costs, right? This is something the social scientists are very bad at thinking about because they never think about costs. They think about simply causality, but in the policy world, to bring about those causal effects, is constantly, not just the public sector, but the private sector. Ivan?
Yeah, no, I just a quick question. So how can you bypass this regulation by using pay for performance, for example? How do these regulations deal with pay for performance?
So I'll talk a little bit about the gig economy, which has revealed in its full glory performance and gender differences in performance and how they translate into gender differences in wage. The gig economy has escaped from pay equity now because it is so patently a question of people being paid according to what they do. My guess is that will come in for scrutiny soon, especially here in California. But generally speaking, performance pay has been seen as part of the problem that pay equity needs to address. Yeah. So not much has escaped the pay equity net. Anytime there is an empirically observed difference in the median wages between men and women, we've got a problem, irrespective of why that is brought about and whether there's an effective solution to it.
Yeah, so is that really what the policymakers are thinking? Because if you think about the Uber example, it's like for conditional, you work Saturday nights, you have a lot of experience, you drive, whatever fat, then gender makes no difference. The reason why males make want to do it is they work at different time, different experience, and so on. I mean, that's it.
Yeah. So I'll come back to that, and how in some ways pay equity is the wrong solution for that problem. If we want to address a issue of positionality of women as a social question, we may want to do that through childcare expenses and accelerated training and stuff. Pay equity was supposed to address unremunerated productivity differences, and that women were be paid less simply because of sexism and discrimination, even though their productivity levels were the same. That was the claim. That was the fundamental claim of pay equity, right? There was a market failure caused by sexism. And in fact, there's this huge cohort of workers whose productivity is not being reflected in their wages. And the reason for that is some reason the market is broken down and we have sub optimal wages.
This is the last question. So do you have an example for a pay equity policy that sort of said they should pay the same regardless of competence, experience, when they work, and so on and so forth? Is that
so? And I'll talk about this in a minute. But generally, pay equity policies do allow for what's called work-related characteristics. So if you're the CEO, you should be earning more than the woman in the coffee shop at the front. Okay, that's allowed for. That's allowed for. That's called a work-related characteristic. It's an easily observable, objective characteristic of the work. Experience, rank, education, responsibility, managerial responsibility, supervisory responsibilities, all those things are considered by the sages of pay equity, kind of like the input-output table of Stalinist days. Those are acceptable reasons why wages may vary. But once I can't see externally as the government a reason why Joe is paid more than Sally, I'm saying that's sexism. That's how pay equity works. Okay. Yeah.
Here, just a question. That's not quite true because it denies certain observable things. So my anthropology PhD has to be valued the same as your physics PhD. We're not allowed to look at how inflexible the job is and so forth. It's also, I'd like to challenge a little that there hasn't been analysis. There's been a lot of work on the supposed gender pay gap. Claudia Golden, for example, at Harvard, who's no right winger, but once you put in control variables, there is no gender pay gap. So perhaps the reason why no one's analyzing pay equity is that uncomfortable fact is just staring at you in the data. As you said earlier, it doesn't mean that we don't have discrimination somewhere, but it's discrimination on who takes care of the kids and who gets what kind of training and so forth. But that there is gender discrimination, unless you say control variables are sexist. I think there's a lot of economic literature saying there is no pay gap.
Yeah, that's right. So that's basically at the problem structuring level. And I would agree with you that there is, but even then, it's not really put in policy analytic terms. That's why I say studying the pay equity gap in labor rates is not policy analysis, because policy analysis, again, is a distinctive set of questions which is for policymakers, that first question of problem structuring is there a problem that government should take an interest in, as opposed to the economists who say, is there a gap that's caused by sexism or not? Because even if there is a gap caused by sexism, the government might still decide, some things are just not within the scope of government. So problem structuring is to raise the question of, is there a public action problem, right? It's a distinctive question. And that's why I say that. And then past the problem structuring stage, there is really nothing significant. Okay, so we need to go through these stages. We need to ask about the problem, policy, the cost benefit, and policy revision, which I'll come to in the end. Okay, problem structuring. Is there a pay gap problem? Absolutely right, John. This is an area where there's been a lot of work and the evidence is pretty overwhelming and consistent. But what I like to do is to start with looking at the OECD data. Okay, so here's a nice cross section of OECD countries. This is the classic definition of the gender pay gap, which is the difference between the male and the female median wage as a percentage of the male median wage. Okay, so this is basically the so this is the difference in the wage expressed as a proportion of the male wage, right? So that we're getting essentially a percentage point that is the percentage discount in some ways that women face in their wage rate. Okay, it's essentially like a discount. Ivan?
This is not including the people who are outside of the labor market.
Correct. And this is only full-time employees as well. Okay. Just it suffers a little in validity, but it's very good in reliability. So that's why we use this one, right? It's a very consistent, reliable indicator. So if we go back to the beginnings when pay equity was first starting to talk about, the late 70s, average OECD level was 39% roughly. Okay. It varied. Japan was a little higher. UK, the US were basically around that average. Finland and Australia had very low ones. Interesting to note that the first major pay equity policy came out of Australia, right? At a time when Australia had by far the lowest, and I don't call this a pay gap, by the way, I call this a pay difference. Because gap suggests there's something that's supposed to be filled in, there's like a crack in the concrete, well, there's a difference, right? A difference is not a gap, it just descriptively, there's a difference. So what's interesting is, remember, I told you at the beginning, these countries themselves vary widely in the extent to which they have implemented pay equity policies since 1980, okay? Remember, Japan and South Korea have essentially had no pay equity policies over this time. They've certainly had policies to make it easier for women to join the labor force, and I'll talk about those policies in a little bit. But South Korea and Japan have had zero pay equity policies in place for the most part, enforceable. The UK and the US a little bit in between. Finland and Australia have had the most rigorous and intrusive pay equity policies since this date. Okay. Now, obviously, there's a natural limit, so we would expect that this longitudinal function would be curvilinear, right? It would approach its natural level, would decelerate as it approached zero, which we see from the OECD average, and then that's just the basic exponential function. That's not for these ones, that's for all OECD countries. So we see a slow, 2 points. The difference in gender wages has steadily declined across OECD countries, irrespective of pay equity policies. Indeed, countries that have had less pay equity policies have experienced more rapid declines in absolute terms than countries that have had the more intrusive ones. Of course, the ones that have more intrusive ones started lower, but actually, Australia is pretty amazing because they've gone from over 20% to about 15% over basically coming up on 50 years of incredibly costly and burdensome and intrusive pay equity policies. And basically
all of this ignores lesser developed countries. So what about them? Second or third world countries, as it were? How do they fit in?
Yeah, I just the data is not good enough. And B, I do think as a person who works on public policy, I just think it's like Venus and Mars. I think the OECD rich industrial countries public policy issues are just qualitatively different in terms of their analysis than what we might see in a developed country or even a middle income country. But I actually don't know the answer to your question, actually, in terms of the.
Well, I think that's actually the human question, but that's another point.
Yeah. Yeah, I think analytically, it's just, it's makes more sense to separate the OECD from the non-OECD world. So that's one thing I want to say is note that the pay equity problem, or the gender wage difference problem, has declined significantly since 1975. One might think that as a problem gets less bad or less large, that the discussion or the feverishness with which that problem is talked about would also decline. One of the interesting things about pay equity is it's gone inverse, right? The less and less the gender difference, the more the gender wage difference has declined, the more fevered and excitable the pay equity discourse in the policy area has become, right? The problem is becoming serious. You may have noted President Biden tweeting about it yesterday after a 5-year-old girl wrote to him, and he printed the letter from the White House saying, "I agree, Charlotte, it's terrible that women have to suffer so much and work so much harder." You know, can you imagine? I mean, even Jimmy Carter, you know, tweeting or windmilling about something like that. I mean, so interestingly enough, the pay equity problem has become even more prominent in public policy debates, even as the evidence for it has declined. This is interesting. This is also to do with the sociology of knowledge. I think it's also to do with the role of women in politics. And what I'm going to talk about is female rent seeking in the political system. Okay, so there's
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I just worry, we only have a half an hour and we haven't really got to any substance.
yes, here I come.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, I'm gonna jump ahead.
Sorry.
Okay. Firm level study of the gender wage differences. Because we have the gig economy now, we can measure this very closely. We always knew this was the case, but now these studies of Mechanical Turk, Uber, and the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority basically showing the reason that there are gender wage differences is because men work harder, they work longer, they put in more overtime, they take more unexpected emergency shifts. And once we do that, these studies are showing that there is no evidence of discrimination. Right. So this is basically, in other words, we've taken the work-related characteristics out. Now we're taking out another set of factors, which some economists call productivity-related employment inputs. Okay, PREI. And once we do that, these studies are showing, I won't read this, but essentially, there's nothing to be accounted for from discrimination. We can completely account for wage differences as a result of in the case of Uber, how fast they drive, where they drive, when they drive. The Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority has to do with overtime, less unpaid leave off. And in the case of Mechanical Turk, got to do with work arrangements and whatnot. So, and there's another one that just came out on English tutoring schools in Central Europe, online English tutoring. It's just basically finding the same thing. Okay, so firm level, there's also not a problem. So when we then try and break this down in take the 16.9%, that is the gender wage difference in the US in 2021, we're basically able to account for that 69.9% almost entirely with these two factors. One is the easy work-related characteristics. One person is CEO, the other is a coffee barista. One person requires a PhD, the other requires a community college degree, experience, responsibility, etc. That's the work-related characteristics. PREIs, this is where the new research has shown is the reason why gender wage differences emerge is because of all the stuff about overtime, about greater going into positions that require more training. That's not kind of a diploma, but in-service training, things like this. So with these two things, we almost get up to 15% of the difference, right? Which is close to this. Interestingly enough, marriage, if we just control for marriage, we can capture about 9 percentage points of that 16.9 with that one thing, right? Now, that's a totally legit positionality argument that says marriage causes women to engage in work patterns which lead to less productivity and less work hours and to seek less responsibility. Absolutely legitimate argument, right? But remember, the purpose of pay equity was not to compensate for positionality issues. It was to capture unfair differences in wages that didn't reflect underlying productivity, right? And the evidence is there's no there, right? So in terms of the first stage in the policy analysis problem, there's a quote from Phyllis Schlafly, which I won't read because I think she was basically right in 1984, saying the reason women earn less basically is because they get married, they have kids, they have different preferences and choices. That was in 84, right? Now, we might have said there's still some pretty decent residual straightforward sexism in the workforce in 84. 40 years later, I think the evidence is even more overwhelming, right? We have women CEOs, we have women at all levels of responsibility. And so let's move to the next question, policy choice. Is pay equity the best choice for the problem? So remember, there's basically a distinction between market distorting and market preserving policies. And pay equity is an example of a market distorting policy in the sense of what it does is it intervenes in the market, right? And distorts the decisions made by billions of managers in terms of wage setting. Equal pay, by the way, is also a market distorting policy in my view, because it just begs the question, why is it equal to a bureaucrat if it's not equal to the firm, right? So I think anytime you're basically telling firms what to do with their labor and capital decisions, you're distorting markets. Female quotas are obviously market distorting. Even bans on gender discrimination, are market distorting in the sense that they interfere in decisions that might be made in the absence of government action. So not surprisingly, in some sense, although there's a lot of talk of pay equity, most of the action in the policy sphere has been on the market preserving side in the last 40 years. And this stuff actually takes aim at the positionality differences, which we might all agree are legitimate basis for public policy. There is a problem there. There is something that public policy could help. It would actually be good for the economy, as well as being good for women. So training and mentoring, in maternity leave, childcare, reentry and reintegration rules, so women can exit for child purposes or care purposes and reentry. Pay transparency, just to allow, if there's a degree to which women are less able to negotiate, to allow pay transparency. So these are all market preserving policies which have been adopted widely. Like I say, these are the East Asia, this is where they're working on mainly. But interesting pay equity policies have remained. So policy effectiveness, cause and effect. Remember, does X lead to Y? This is the cause and effect policy. So when we look at the research on longitudinal change in gender wage differences, and these are just econometric models, longitudinal change in the gender difference. Let's look at the longitudinal change in other control variables. We find that socioeconomic change basically accounts for about 2/3 of this, right? So this is why South Korea and Japan have experienced very rapid declines in the gender wage difference, because their women have become more educated, because their women have generated the ability in society to take on leadership roles. They've been accepted more into leadership roles as they've become more educated. You get about 2/3 of the change just by looking for straightforward changes in educational composition, for example, human capital, various human capital measures. Other policies on gender, like some of those market preserving policies, seem to account for basically the remaining third. And there's not much left for pay equity policies to explain longitudinally, right? So then there's a question of there's no effectiveness either, right? And maybe that's no surprise to the extent that the decomposition analysis shows there wasn't a problem in the first place, but we can do this longitudinal analysis, not much evidence of policy effectiveness. Okay, so there's some interesting studies. This is a study of 4 provinces in Canada where Ontario had a very intrusive and quite demanding, and still does, pay equity policy. British Columbia, Alberta, and Manitoba had varying degrees of either just a framework in British Columbia, no policy at all in Alberta, not surprisingly. Manitoba had only a public sector policy. So what the synthetic province of Ontario they generated was basically a province that is socioeconomically reconstructed using these 3 other provinces, right? In terms of its industrial size, its population size, right, its economy. So they construct essentially a synthetic Ontario, and they look at what happens to the gender earnings difference in this synthetic province with only these very weak pay equity policies versus the actual province with the strong ones. Well, guess what? The synthetic province does better in their study. And their conclusion, quite strong, if Ontario had not enacted the pay equity policy about 20 years ago, the current gender gap would be about the same as it currently is. Actually, it'd be smaller. And so it suggests actually these policies are not just ineffective, they're actually potentially counterproductive. It's an area of research I haven't seen any work in, but essentially pay equity policies are bad for the gender wage difference, right? They actually have a negative effect. Okay, policy efficiency. Do they do this efficiently? So here we need to do what, this is firm level analysis. Now we're going to the level of the firm. What does this look like at the level of the firm? There's a lot of costs for firms to do pay equity. This imposes probably an average of, I estimate in this paper, $45,000 per firm per year for a 100 employee firm. Okay. I say $45,000, that's kind of chump change. It's made up of the administrative costs of the survey, then the pay equity and the analysis, then you get wage increases. And then, in the US, this is a much bigger one than in the EU, but the legal and arbitration risk is a very big one here. This is why companies tend to do this. We then take these costs, right, which range from essentially 0 to 70,000 if we take kind of the no pay equity policy places and the very intrusive ones. And we map them against what we observed in terms of like the maxed out decade-long decline in the gender wage difference, which tends to be about 4 or 4.5. And this is what cost effectiveness shows us is if we wanted to achieve a really rapid decline in the gender wage difference, this is assuming this works, but just assuming that this is a functionally accurate description of pay equity policy, we would need to impose a much more stringent regime of pay equity onto the entire private sector. We would need to essentially mandate equal wages, right? And by the way, the reason the public sector does better in gender wage differences is because they essentially mandate equal wages, right? Because they have a soft budget constraint. So essentially, we would need to move the private sector into a kind of public sector model where gender wage differences and pay equity is pursued not as a means, right? Not as a means to tease out hidden productivity similarities that should be equally remunerated, but actually just to impose gender wages, which is what you see in the public sector. On the other hand, if we take what this is actually costing us per year, it's not really I actually think it's generated nothing, but in the most charitable account, it's generating a very small decadal decline in the gender wage difference, probably a lot smaller than what just regular socioeconomic change is generating. Okay, let me introduce you to Jerry Chevrolet in the suburbs of Baltimore, Maryland. Jerry Chevrolet is a Chevy dealership. They also have a used car lot, and I think they have a couple of other dealerships with them. They sell cars, they service cars, they have a warehouse, they're great people. They have a very mixed workforce. They seem to be a real kind of pillar of the community in suburban Baltimore. Jerry Chevrolet. If you're buying a car, go to Jerry Chevrolet. Okay. Jerry Chevrolet had a problem with their female parts warehouse manager. They felt she was not performing optimally. Jerry Chevrolet went and recruited a male warehouse operator in order to overcome what they perceived as the lack of productivity of the female one, who they hired in at a higher wage rate than the female. Female went to the Equal Opportunities Commission in Washington, who promptly set an army of lawyers and litigation specialists, your tax dollars at work, on poor Jerry Chevrolet. Jerry Chevrolet probably should have just classified this new warehouse manager as a new classification, senior warehouse manager specialist, right? But Jerry Chevrolet is a car dealership. They're trying to sell cars, right? They don't have the time or the money for an army of consultants and pay equity specialists and litigation risk consultants. They're trying to sell cars. So what do? Well, they just settle it out and get on with their job. EOC last November, Jerry Chevrolet, Jerry's Motor Cars will pay $62,000 to settle EOC equal pay and retaliation suit, which they did, right? So they paid it off. If you read the complaint, it's pretty clear what happened here, which is Jerry Chevrolet couldn't be bothered. Go through the act of showing they were not being sexist. They were just doing what a business does, which is pay someone who's more productive a higher wage. But this is kind of where pay equity is now, right? It's become a kind of administrative overreach that small businesses in particular cannot afford to fight. There's also reputational risks in fighting this. So Jerry Chevrolet pays the shakedown money and hopes they can make it up by selling a few more Chevys in the 2023 year. Okay, that's where we are with pay equity law. I think it's disgraceful. Cost benefit analysis. Okay, this is going to take us well beyond simple pay equity law. But if you know public policy analysis, eventually most public policies justification loads heavily upon their indirect costs and benefits, not their direct costs and benefits, right? So is there, as a last gasp, an argument that pay equity policies have very large outsized indirect benefits, okay, such as female participation or the perception of fairness, right, and therefore workplace harmony. So we can put together a table. Sorry, you can't see it that well. The narrow stuff we've already talked about is in the top on the benefits side and on the cost side. You know, the benefit side is, well, when you pay women more, you get employment income gains for women. But of course, the knock-on effects are we have firm level productivity losses because essentially work is being overcompensated. We have firm level compliance costs, which we've talked about. You know, does this make the workplace more harmonious or does that make the workplace less harmonious? I don't know the evidence out on that. Even if you knew, how would you monetize that? I mean, we're getting into some very uncertain territory, but the big argument ultimately is going to be on the indirect ones, right? So pay equity policy causes labor market deepening because female participation opportunity. Yes, it's true that you might have women going into more senior roles and holding more senior roles when they're being overcompensated for it. Secondly, there might be some macroeconomic efficiency gains because of that. And obviously, if wage rates are going up in the absence of anything else, you'll get higher tax revenues from payroll taxes. On the other hand, a lot of this from the studies that I cite is actually more likely to be on the cost side. Macroeconomic efficiency losses. Yes, that is the standard neoclassical model, but there's nothing to suggest the standard neoclassical model is incorrect in this case. If wage rates are set higher than the productivity associated with those jobs, then income from that activity will decline. If the income declines, then the value added will decline and we have macroeconomic efficiency losses. Government opportunity cost is kind of like, well, what else could we be doing with this big pay equity apparatus? And if you know anyone who does pay equity, it is incredibly time consuming for everyone involved to do these detailed studies of whether John in the welding shop should be paid more than Sarah, who's doing some reconciliation of insurance claims in the insurance shop. I mean, who's going to make that comparison, right? Very time consuming for both government and private sector. There's a lot of evidence of male wage suppression and male labor force participation suppression, not surprisingly, right? Because essentially this is a form of male wage suppression, institutionalized male wage suppression. And the study that just came out from Denmark suggesting a fairly significant decline in male labor force participation after pay equity policies were introduced. Okay. I'm going to throw out a few other values to keep in mind with pay equity policy. First of all, it seems to me a straightforward case of an intrusion on economic freedom. Now, we have a lot of intrusions on economic freedom for various good public policy reasons, but let's not forget this is essentially kind of lien on private property, right? On the use of private property. So I'm not allowed to deploy my capital in this way. It's a constraint on economic freedom. We would need to put that into the cost side as we do with any government action. This is a form of systemic misandry. Just going to call it what it is. This is institutionalized discrimination against men. Because if we really cared about pay equity, we should, in theory, require intra-female pay equity comparisons and intra-male pay equity comparisons as well, right? If the issue is someone is being paid less than their productivity, why limit the comparison to males and females, right? And what's interesting is the evidence is when you have a female manager in an organization, there's no noticeable decline in gender wage differences, right? Whereas if the problem was all this male sexism, we would assume that that would decline as females rose up into positions of managerial authority. We don't see that. So now we have some internalized sexism for senior women, which then needs to be subject to a further pay equity policy. You can see that this is difficult. This also bears on the policy irrationality problem and administrative abuse. I think the example I gave of Jerry Chevrolet is just straightforward administrative abuse. It's an out of control administrative state, with too many lawyers and too many activists thinking that it has a right to step into the key decisions of people who make jobs and make economic activity. And there's very little scrutiny about this, okay? There, my scrutiny was here. This is the talk. You know, you just got it. That's the administrative feedback. Okay, my conclusion, pay equity policies, ineffective, inefficient response to a non-problem. Couple of things on policy revision. So if we were to revise pay equity policy, we need to deal with both the policy analysis to get the policy analysis right, but we need to deal with the politics or the policy process. The problem with policy analysis is it's all done by women who are advocates for pay equity policies. And I just did the 69 articles with 99 authors last year in the Academic Search Premier. Basically 3/4 of the authors are women, right? So it's a big gender bias problem in pay equity research, right? Which obviously is not seen as a problem, but it is. This paper in its first peer review is described as a convoluted justification for maintaining men's economic power. Yes, rejected, right? Okay, whatever, it's on ResearchGate. I don't even care about getting it published in a journal like this anymore. Jonathan Kraft, University of Toronto, editor of Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis. Let him know what you think. Female rent seeking in the policy process is, I think, ultimately the elephant in the room here. As women have risen into positions of political power, like any interest group in public policy theory, we expect them to mobilize and to rent seek around shared interests where they see opportunities in the political system to obtain benefits. Well, that's what we have right now. And this is why I think it's very hard to revise pay equity policies. This is also why pay equity policies have become even more intrusive and demanding, even as the gender wage difference has steadily declined to nearly nothing. Thank you. The paper is on ResearchGate.
Thank you very much. I think Pat has a number of questions, maybe. Yeah.
Probably shut the.
Oh, hello, Bruce. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. And
Stop the sharing.
Yeah.
my wife is actually in public policy, and she would love it as a policy analyst. And I'm not a policy person. I'm philosophically minded. So I asked the question is, now what's the most expedient way to get this done? And what's the best gradient in your slope of economic analysis? But whether you should go left or right, should we actually do this thing? So let me raise a few points, and then you can then decide how you want to answer as you wish. So the first question or comment I would have is that all this discussion and its motivation totally assumes that gender is a social construct and totally ignores the biological foundations of gender differences. And people like Gad Sadka have spoken at great length about that. But that's one of the points that I bring up here as something that's as an elephant in the room. The second point that's an elephant in the room that I think you began to allude to, but didn't really touch upon, is that all this discussion totally ignores all aspects of equality, let alone equity, such as things like workplace fatalities, military fatalities, time spent working long hours, 100-hour work weeks, that sort of thing. Those are anomalous things that largely men do. They take these sort of anomalous situations, and that's been happening for all of human history. The third point, which I'll conclude with, is what about the national differences? Because South Korea is a very different society than Australia, and that was true in 1930. And by the same token, China and India are very different societies than each other. Everyone has these same questions of equality or equity, whether we should even do them at all. And it's a very different question if you ask India in 1960, when most men were still banana farmers and their wives were washing dishes. And still probably mostly are. So those are the three questions that I came up with in discussion, which was, like I said, it was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. So I agree with you, and I'll be very brief. So my point here is whether or not a given country wants to act upon positionality issues, that is to say the fundamental biological and socialized differences in the genders, both for good and ill for men and women, such as you say, men are more likely to die on the job, men more likely to suffer heart attacks, men live longer, live less long. There's all kinds of positionality issues against men and women. All I'm saying is, I think that's a legitimate topic for any given country to think about and make its own legitimate democratic decisions about through a public policy process, because I think there is a clear difference in positionality. But my point is pay equity is intended to address something that is non-existent for the most part, as far as I can tell, which is unremunerated wages that are not reflecting productivity differences. So my only argument is.
Seems like one of the things you hit upon really hit the nail on the head, which is there's a large fraction of the people who are doing this work who are of probably a coherent line of thought. It's not a herd of cats by any stretch of the imagination. Science is a herd of cats, and probably political science used to be a herd of cats in 1950. I don't think the field is a herd of cats right now. It seems to be a coherent group of people with a narrative. So that's one point. And when there's a coherent group of people with a narrative, it turns out at some point they turn out into an interest group. And there is no interest group of straight white males. And I, for one, thinking, well, gee, I mean, if everyone else has an interest group, then you have one too, go forth and prosper. Because if everyone's going to be a micro interest group, then I'll make one too, based upon myself. I don't know what that would be. You know, it's sort of preposterous to think about, but people have made interest groups based upon being a woman. And now you could do it.
You're running out of time.
Okay, yeah, so I think that's right. I thought, do you have a question in the room?
Yeah, so I tell you, where I was confused is you started to talk out saying that there hasn't been any work since those two earlier books, okay? And I understand there's tons of work on the gender pay gap. So what in the talk was the new work? Like, and when you saw that picture of the cost benefit analysis and you drew that picture, where was that data coming from?
Well, so it's different sources that are in the paper, so you can look at it, you can see where I'm bringing that out of.
That's work you just done.
That's my work, yes, that's my work, that's the original work. The cost effective analysis chart is my original work, yay. The rest is my bringing together secondary literature.
So I think a lot of what you've talked about stems from just a poor public understanding of the facts and evidence. You know, the serious economic papers that look at the gender wage difference, they're very clear on the results that virtually all of the difference is explained by job characteristics and experience. When I talk to educated friends, virtually no one knows that fact and no one believes that fact when I tell them that. I even would claim that among trained economists, the majority don't know that fact or are resistant to that fact and don't really want to discuss it. Thoughts on that? Or
It's just an inconvenient truth. And what do you do with an inconvenient truth? I mean, I do think like most people's attitude is, yes, I know this is irrational. Yes, I know that's a myth that women only earn 83 cents for every man, but I'm not fighting that battle because we have an out of control national debt and I'm going to fight that battle. And this one is just, this is Sicily. I'm paying off the mafia. Fine, here's your shakedown money. Can we get back to trying to focus on honestly, I think that's where we are. And I also think, you know, the reason I talk about policy analysis, why it's important is because if we started to insist on people following more traditional policy analytic methods when they address this question, rather than gender wage studies, right, which simply say, oh my goodness, there's still a gender wage. And it's always called stubborn or persistent, right, or frustrating, right? And that's the end of the analysis. That's not analysis, right? That's not what policy analysis is supposed to do.
Yeah, well, so going to Jasper, so there's like the lawyer studies, there's like well-known paper in the QD, I think, on lawyers, the female lawyers versus male lawyers, right? And it's exactly like the Uber paper. The male lawyers that work more and whatever, and burn them in and all and so on. But I wouldn't say that there's like not many high quality papers on this. So it's like perfectly rational to say, I believe there's a big whatever gender gap because of discrimination. And I mean, if that's your prior, then these 2 papers or 3 papers are going to be like, yeah, sure, I can see there's some evidence right in those contexts, but I still believe in you know, what I still hold on to this. I think that's a rational.
How about all the cross-sectional evidence that Claudia Golden's work and the many papers she's written and all the literature that's followed that? It's not just a couple papers.
There is a lot of prior work. The gig economy ones are only because we only got these gig firms that we could actually literally observe, like in real time. But to your point, it's still not making a difference.
But no, I'm not really.
It's like, why is this belief so persistent?
I'd say that in like super high quality,
think-
or particular context, you can still hold the view that generally whatever there's like systematic this and that. I'm not saying I'm holding that view.
Biden just announced March 14 is National Equal Pay Day. But that's not gonna exactly proceed from the.
I mean, I'm a hypocrite. I'm a micro beneficiary of equal pay because my wife's job in the public sector is remunerated at a far higher rate than it would be without it, right? But don't forget, don't think like a peasant, think like a banker, right? Don't be micro smart and macro stupid, because the overall effect on our economy and the well-being of our society is vastly degraded by pay equity policies, even if you think it's working for you. Even as a woman, if you think it's working for you, it's not.
Amy Webs.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on this suggestion that there's a lot of delusional thinking out there about this topic. And I see that as both a political failure and an educational failure. It's a political failure in the sense that when you're voting for the Democratic Party, you are voting for these policies. So, one corollary of that is we have democratically chosen these policies. I mean, by voting for Democrats, we vote for this sort of perverse stuff. So we can't really complain that something is being imposed on us. But we can complain, I think, about the Republican Party for failing to take a sophisticated, informed, and monolithic, consistent view about these policies, that they're ill-conceived, that they're unwise, and telling the public the reasons why they are bad policies. The Republican Party is afraid to say things like, yeah, mothers tend to cut back on their ambitions and their hours. Men on average work harder and longer, and they're afraid to tell the truth about what's really going on. I'm not sure what they're afraid of, but they are, and that warrants examination. The second is, these are complicated questions that involve quantitative analysis, and the education system is pushing a line on people, even, at high levels of competitive universities. And there isn't enough balance in the way these topics are presented to students, and that is the fault of the education system as a whole, but also the economics profession. So there's more than enough blame to go around here, I think.
Yeah, both good points, Amy. And so I guess when I say it's not a legitimate subject of action, I mean in a policy perspective. In a political perspective, it's absolutely legitimate for the Democrats to say, we don't care what the evidence says, this is what we're doing. And it's actually legitimate for the Republicans to say, we're not dying on this hill, we got other ones to fight. I think, so okay, that's just the superstructure. What's the substructure? We are the substructure. We're supposed to be changing the narrative. We're supposed to be having the seminars like this. We're supposed to be publishing the papers, creating the debate. Well, guess what? Not surprisingly, this paper has been rejected twice already after being sent to feminist economists who accuse me of misogyny. And secondly, from the standpoint of pedagogy, as you say, I mean, you're right. I mean, most undergraduates will come out with a social science degree who can't read a longitudinal diagram, just straight longitudinal data, who can't fit a curve to it, who can't interpret, a simple regression model that attributes causal influence to different factors. And that's a problem, because that's ultimately how we're going to show this policy is not a good one. And if we have illiterates, then it has no traction. So good points.
Any other question? I don't know if, Pat, you have a last question there? No?
Yes, I guess, sorry to be long-winded as I always am. I'm quite interested and I feel like maybe the broad question, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is equity in what way? And if you want to be equitable, then be equitable in all ways. And that means you have the suicide gap, as you mentioned, or so forth. And now people are starting to mention that. Then you take the approach that's basically being socialistic communist in your approach, as opposed to being libertarian. And nature is libertarian. Nature has its own way. We're trying to force something onto nature. And I think that's maybe the thing that strikes me the most, especially as a scientist. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so if you take a kind of philosophical normative approach to equity, the logic of the argument leads ineluctably to centralized wage setting, right? Because not that centralized wage setting will be actually equitable. For those of our friends from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe will know it wasn't, but there'll be a claim that it's equitable. It'll be claimed that wages are set according to an ethical justification, not the market, right? And because bureaucratic ethics are normatively defensible and market decisions are normatively indefensible, right? We'll still claim that centralized wage setting is more ethical. And you're absolutely right. Once we start opening up questions of equity and comparative worth, it doesn't stop anywhere. So actually in Australia right now, and I want to say it's New South Wales, a woman can bring a pay equity claim to an employment tribunal that makes no comparator group, but simply argues that she's being devalued in her job on a purely ethical basis, right? She doesn't have to point to a male comparator with the same job. She doesn't even have to point to a comparator group that's dominated by males. She can simply make a value claim.
In a way that might affect us in Australia, they might have actual equity for proposal funding.
Yes.
So that's going to affect us. I mean,
There's a really interesting study I cite in the paper done of Hollywood. So there's two kind of jobs in Hollywood that are pretty female and male dominated. The costume designers tend to be female dominated and the set designers tend to be male dominated, right? And guess what? Costume designers are paid less on average than the set designers. So there is, I think there's a suit in place right now that's going through the system, but these economists at a UC school went and studied the two, and they studied basically a whole bunch of ranges of characteristics of these two jobs. They just kind of imposed an equal weighting on everything, and they said, oh, it's the same job. They should be paid the same, right? But then you look at actually what they're comparing. One of them, for example, is safety and security. Risk of major injury or death on the job is virtually nil for the costume designers, is actually not insignificant for the production set designers. The costume set designers do not need to do any specialized safety training. The production set designers have to have special safety protocols. The costume designers very rarely interact with the talent, right? And you can imagine that in Hollywood, interacting with talent is, you know, a highly stressful and unpleasant job. The production set designers, almost to a man, top to bottom, have to interact with the talent. I'm not sure why that is, but that is. So it's very easy to look at their study and say, of course, the production set designers are paid more, right? But the logic of the pay equity is like, if I see a female dominated job and a male dominated job, I'm going to impose a false equivalence on.
Yeah, we should. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you.
You know, Jules, who's on an airplane right now, brought up another issue that a lot of these studies miss, which is that if you work for a defined benefit company, a woman's defined benefit plan is a lot more valuable. Put that in. I'm not sure you get an bed, right? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you put that in, that you would actually see the gender gap at all. Right? Because once you control for everything, the gender gaps in the single percentages, right?
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah, because this is working age population.
yeah.
It's not lifetime earnings.
Yeah, okay.
You want to join?
I'm happy to join you.
Okay.
I was like,
Thank you, everyone.
tell me about your work on colonialism at lunch. I'll be interested.